Now in today's video, we're continuing on with our tech catch-up. In the last one, we took a look at the Nvidia Geforce GTX 780 Ti and kind of found that it's actually a little bit flat nowadays and pretty much come to the end of its life. But how well has the card that replaced it held up? Well, in today's video, that's exactly what we're going to find out. Now in our last video, we did take a look at the Nvidia GTX 780 Ti and it was very disappointing. It is just a card that is not built for 2023, and even though some of the games that we actually tested with it were pretty old, to be honest, it really struggled. It actually struggled to pretty much start many games, and that's because of the limitations in its VRAM and the fact that it's just not supported in drivers anymore. But its replacement was a different story. This is the Nvidia Geforce GTX 980 Ti. Nvidia actually did increase this card by quite a bit generation to generation, and even though the cards themselves look identical, outside of looks, that's pretty much where the similarities end. The GTX 980 Ti was released in 2015 as Nvidia's flagship GPU, and there was absolutely nothing that would compete with it at the time. If you'd have purchased one of these new back then, you would have paid around $650 for it, or £550 if you're in the UK, which at the time would have been quite an expensive GPU, but nowadays you can actually pick them up pretty cheap. I actually managed to pick this exact card up for just £55 from eBay, and it actually came in pretty decent shape. It is of course an Nvidia reference model, so it does have a blower style cooler, but it is completely different when it actually comes to using it than the 780 Ti. I found that the GTX 780 Ti was a very hot card that had a very loud noise from its blower cooler, but I found the complete opposite with the 980 Ti. I don't know what they've actually changed in terms of the cooler design. They look identical, but this card run extremely quiet and reasonably cool as well. I actually really like the Nvidia Founders Edition cards. I think they look fantastic, particularly when I like to collect cards and show them off on the channel, and I was actually really impressed with the purchase that I made. Underneath this fantastic looking cooler, we do have some reasonably good specs, particularly for the time, and to demonstrate that, I've actually put it in between the card that it replaced as well as the one that replaced it. The GTX 980 Ti is sitting on a GM200 GPU. It has a base clock speed of 1000 MHz, a boost clock of 1076 MHz. It has 2816 shaders, but probably the biggest difference between this card and the GTX 780 Ti is of course the memory. The GTX 980 Ti comes with 6GB of GDDR5, which particularly in 2023 is going to make all the difference when it comes to play some of those more modern games. It does have the same memory interface as both the 780 Ti and the 1080 Ti, as well as the same power consumption of around 250 watts. Now of course, still being supported by Nvidia's drivers and having 6GB of GDDR5 RAM, you can expect a better experience than the one that we got with the 780 Ti. But what does that experience actually look like? Well, to find out, we actually did some benchmarking, but this time we've used a completely brand new test suite. We've upgraded our test suite to contain some more brand new games, and I really think that that actually starts to really test some of these cards, particularly with some of the types of titles that are dropping today, which are extremely demanding. But let's take a look at some of those benchmarks and see how well this card still performs. So as you can see from the benchmarks, this card is not dead yet. It actually managed to start and play all of the games in our brand new test suite, and pretty much all of those games are from 2023. There are only 2 titles that we actually kind of included from 2022, and the reason for that is to kind of show the difference between 2022 games and 2023 games. We will of course update our test suite as we go along, but for now I think those games will do fine. Of course, this card didn't perform very well in those higher resolutions, but we did see some great results when we were actually in 1080p. For the 1080p results, in Dead Island 2 we managed to get 71 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 37, and you can kind of see that the picture is similar as we walk along. Most games getting near or over 60 frames per second, apart from Starfield and The Last of Us, where we only saw around 30 frames per second on average. That's not great, but of course this card is actually reasonably old, so it's done a pretty good job here. In 1440p, again, we saw some great results, particularly in those top 5 titles there, getting an average of 48 frames per second in Dead Island 2, and an average of 57 on High on Life. The 1% lows here do start dropping a little bit, so you will get a few stutters in the games, but we are talking about a high quality preset here on some of the most modern titles out there, so something is expected. Again, Starfield and The Last of Us performed exceptionally bad here, only getting 18 frames per second on average for Starfield and 23 on The Last of Us. That actually made the games completely unplayable, so I wouldn't recommend you playing those on this card with that preset. 4K is probably not even worth talking about. Every single game suffered here and was completely unplayable, which is expected for this kind of aged card. The best title here was Spider-Man Remastered, which is a game from 2022 where we managed to get an average of 28 frames per second with a 1% low of 16. Again, still, even though it's 28 frames per second, due to those low 1% lows, the game didn't provide a very good experience. Now, the card may not have performed very well at 1440p or 4K, and I wouldn't have expected it to either, but it did actually give some decent results in 1080p, which kind of makes this card still a decent option for those on a super tight budget who actually only want to play 1080p games. But I didn't actually want to leave that there. I wanted to see if we can actually just tweak some settings and see if we can get this card at least running at around 60 FPS on any of those titles. And to do that, we had to do some more testing just to see what it would take to actually get it there. And I think we found some interesting results. In Dead Island 2, we managed to get an average of 60 frames per second in a resolution of 1440p by changing the preset to medium and enabling FSR with a quality setting. We also enabled VSync on this just to smoothen everything out, and it gave a pretty decent gaming experience. You could complete that game from start to finish with this card in those settings, and you would have a great gaming experience as well. High on Life was a very similar picture to Dead Island 2, keeping the resolution in a 1440p with a medium preset and enabling FSR2 with a quality setting. We managed to lock the game at 60 FPS, and not only did that provide a decent gaming experience, the settings themselves actually gave a pretty good picture quality. I was actually reasonably impressed with that kind of game, although it is a game from 2022, so it probably should perform better than some of the others. In Hogwarts Legacy, we managed to get a decent locked 60 FPS by setting the resolution to 1080p, turning the preset down to a medium, and enabling FSR2 with a quality preset. We also enabled VSync on this game just to smoothen everything out, just like we did with the others, and it gave a great gaming experience, and to be honest, made me really want to play that game. Resident Evil 4 is probably the most optimized game on the list, and it wasn't very difficult to get a 60 FPS experience. All you had to do was set the game to a 1080p resolution, set the preset to a high preset, and enable FSR2 with a quality setting. In our testing, we also enabled VSync just like we did on all the others, just to smoothen things out a little bit, and it actually performed exceptionally well. Spider-Man Remastered was the other game from 2022, and just like the others, didn't take a lot to actually get a 60 FPS experience. We managed to actually run this game in a 1440p resolution with a medium preset and no help from any software. All we did was enable VSync again just to smoothen things out, and the game played and looked stunning. Now, unfortunately, in Starfield, we couldn't actually get a 60 FPS experience no matter what we did to the game. To be able to even get there, you would have to drop the resolution below 1080p, but it is one of the most newest and demanding games on the list, so anything that could actually improve on the results we got before would probably be a win for us. Running in a 1080p resolution with a low preset and enabling FSR2, we managed to get an average of 46 frames per second, which actually made the game actually playable, although it didn't look very good. The last game in our test suite was of course The Last of Us Part 1. Now, The Last of Us does tend to run very badly on most of the hardware that we test, and we didn't exactly get a 60 FPS experience, but we did get close. Setting the resolution to a 1080p resolution with a low preset and enabling FSR2 with a performance setting, we managed to get 55 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 43. That meant that the game was actually more than playable, although you were getting a more of a console experience, but if you really wanted to play it, you could on a GTX 980 Ti. So that is our look at the GTX 980 Ti in 2023. I was actually quite surprised at how well this card still performed, particularly when I looked at the GTX 780 Ti previously and it performed very bad. This card will actually start the games, and you can probably thank Nvidia for continuing on to support the drivers, as well as doubling up the RAM generation to generation. I would say though that I wouldn't recommend anybody going out and purchasing one of these today, particularly for gaming, because you're going to limit yourself quite a bit and it's not going to last very long. If you look at those results that we got, the newest titles on there are where this card is really starting to struggle. And there are much better options out there on the market, particularly in the pre-owned market, where you can get something much better for this for similar price. If you pay a little bit more, you can actually get a card that will blow this out of the water and be on much newer technology. But this card was from 2015, so it's actually held up pretty well, and I think it's going to look fantastic in the studio as more of a showpiece. Let me know in the comments below if you've got a GTX 980 Ti or if you're still running one, and what your experiences are. What kind of games are you playing, so I can kind of see what people are using them for out there. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. We do have another Nvidia graphics card that we want to take a look at, and you guys won't want to miss that. And I'm sure, as always, we will catch you in the next one.